Los Angeles, a sleek, modern space in the heart of downtown, featuring emerging street artists and muralists. London, a historic building turned into a contemporary art haven, celebrating both classical techniques and innovative new styles. Paris, a bold statement in the heart of the European art world, breaking the traditional norms that had excluded so many. Tokyo, Johannesburg, Rio de Janeiro, the vision spread like wildfire. Each location had its own distinct identity, but the mission remained the same: elevate the unheard. Empower the unseen. Tell the stories no one else would. Jalen wasn't just running galleries. He was rewriting the rules of the art industry. Breaking records and shattering expectations, the media couldn't ignore it. Time magazine, the new king of the art world, how Jalen Okoye built an empire from rejection. The New York Times, art for the people, not just the privileged, the Okoye movement. Forbes, Jalen Okoye becomes the youngest black gallery owner to gross over $100 million in sales. His collectors weren't just billionaires in hidden mansions. Everyday people could now afford limited edition prints, allowing his movement to reach everyone, not just the elite. And in the middle of it all? Victor Langley. Victor's new reality. At first, Victor Langley hated every second of it. Working under Jalen, watching his former gallery thrive in a way he had never managed, was a bitter pill to swallow. But over time, something changed. He started listening. He saw the passion in these new artists, their struggles, their triumphs, their raw, unfiltered talent. For the first time in decades, Victor felt excited about art again. One evening, he walked into Jalen's office. "You were right," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I built walls around what art could be. You tore them down." Jalen leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Victor exhaled, shaking his head. "So what happens next?" Jalen grinned. "We go bigger." The Okoye legacy begins. By the time Jalen was 35, Okoye galleries were in every major cultural hub across the globe. His movement inspired a new generation of artists, proving that talent didn't need permission from old gatekeepers to thrive. One night, as Jalen stood in the middle of his flagship New York gallery, he saw something that made him pause. A young artist, nervous, portfolio in hand, approaching the front desk, just like he had years ago. Jalen walked over, smiling. "You here to show us your work?" The young artist nodded hesitantly. Jalen extended a hand. "Come on in. Let's see what you've got." And just like that, the cycle continued. But this time, the doors were wide open. Undiscovered talents with stories that deserve to be told. And they won't need to beg for approval from people like you anymore. Langley sat stiffly, unable to argue. But then, Jalen said something that caught him completely off guard. "I'm keeping you on as an advisor." Langley's eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," Jalen said. "You still know how to run a gallery, even if you were blind to real talent. I could throw you out, sure. But I'd rather have you here, watching. Learning." Langley's pride flared. "I don't need to be taught by you." Jalen shrugged. "Then walk away." Langley hesitated. He couldn't. His reputation was already in shambles. If he walked away now, he'd have nothing left. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. Jalen smiled. "Good. Then let's get to work." A new era begins. Within 6 months, the transformation was undeniable. The old, sterile walls of Langley Fine Arts were gone. In their place, Okoye Gallery was filled with bold, vibrant, powerful works of art, pieces that told stories, pieces that mattered. Opening night was a spectacle. The gallery was packed with elite collectors, celebrities, and rising artists. News outlets covered the event, hailing it as the dawn of a new era in the art world. Jalen stood at the entrance, watching as guests murmured in awe at the raw emotion in the paintings, at the variety of styles and backgrounds of the artists he had curated. Victor Langley stood beside him, stiff and silent. He still didn't fully understand Jalen's vision. But he couldn't deny the success. Jalen turned to him. "See that?" he said, nodding at the crowd. "This is what happens when you give talent a chance, no matter where they come from." Langley didn't respond right away. But after a long pause, he finally sighed. "I was wrong about you," he admitted quietly. "About your art." Jalen smiled. "I know." And with that, he walked into his gallery, his own gallery, knowing that this was just the beginning. Jalen Okoye stood in the center of Okoye Gallery, soaking in the energy of the space. Just months ago, this place had been a fading relic of the past, an exclusive playground for the elite. Now, it pulsed with life. The walls were alive with vibrant colors, bold strokes, and stories that refused to be ignored. And yet, this was only the beginning. His phone buzzed. "Xavier Lorenzo." Jalen answered, already knowing what was coming. "You did it, man," Lorenzo said, his voice filled with pride. "But you're not done yet." Jalen smiled. "I know." From a single gallery to a global movement over the next year, Okoye Gallery wasn't just a success, it was a revolution. Artists from all over the world, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, began submitting their work, eager to be part of the movement. For decades, their art had been overlooked by the mainstream fine art world. Not anymore. Jalen expanded quickly. Langley swallowed hard, his pride shattered. He had no choice but to sell, he was too deep in debt to refuse. Jalen watched as Langley shakily picked up the pen. And then, with a single signature, Langley Fine Arts no longer belonged to Victor Langley. It belonged to Jalen Okoye. The young black artist he had once mocked was now his new boss. And Jalen wasn't done yet. Victor Langley sat frozen, the realization hitting him harder than he ever thought possible. Jalen Okoye. The name now echoed across the art world. The young black artist he had once dismissed, mocked, and told to find a different career was now sitting across from him, buying the very gallery that rejected him. His gallery. His legacy. His entire life's work. And there was nothing he could do about it. Langley's hands trembled as he lowered the pen after signing the final document. It was official. Langley Fine Arts no longer existed. It was now Okoye Gallery. A different kind of victory. Jalen leaned back in his chair, studying Langley carefully. He could see the older man's humiliation, the tight jaw, the clenched fists, the way his eyes darted around the room like he was searching for an escape. Years ago, Jalen had left this very gallery feeling small, invisible, insignificant. Now, he was the one holding all the power. But power alone wasn't enough. This wasn't about revenge. Jalen exhaled slowly. "You know, Victor," he said, tapping his fingers against the polished wood desk. "I could have walked in here and humiliated you the way you humiliated me. I could have made a public spectacle out of this. Made you beg for a job, forced you out of the industry entirely." Langley stiffened, eyes burning with silent resentment. "But that's not why I did this," Jalen continued. "I didn't buy this gallery to destroy it. I bought it to fix it." Langley frowned. "Fix it?" "Yes," Jalen said. "For decades, you built a gallery that catered to a very specific kind of artist. The same wealthy, well-connected painters with the same styles, the same backgrounds, the same stories. You shut the door on everyone else." He tilted his head. "I was one of them." Langley looked away, but he said nothing. "So now?" Jalen smiled. "Now, this place is going to be something different. A place for real talent, not just the ones who fit your mold. This gallery is about to become a home for underrated, overlooked, and diverse artists." Langley's mouth tightened. "You'll ruin its reputation." Jalen let out a short laugh. "The reputation you built?" He shook his head. "Your reputation is already dead, Victor. The art world has moved on. And guess what? The biggest collectors in the world are already waiting to see what I do with this space. Langley swallowed hard. He knew Jalen was right. The younger man continued. I've already got my first lineup of featured artists. Some of them were turned away from this gallery just like I was. Some are fresh. His biggest collectors had moved on. His revenues had plummeted. Now, facing bankruptcy, Langley was desperate to sell. He had been contacting potential buyers for weeks, investors, developers, even rival galleries, but the market was ruthless. No one wanted an outdated institution struggling to stay relevant. That's when he received a call from a private investor expressing interest in purchasing Langley Fine Arts outright. Langley didn't ask many questions. He didn't care who the buyer was. He just needed the sale. The meeting the next afternoon, Victor Langley sat in his now half-empty gallery, going over the contract, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. His once flourishing business now had a fading reputation and mounting debt. The front doors opened, and Jalen Okoye walked in. Langley barely looked up. He had no reason to recognize the young black man in the designer suit. "Ah, Mr. Okoye," Langley greeted, standing up. "You're representing the buyer, correct?" Jalen's lips curled into a small smile. "Something like that." Langley sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Well, let's get down to business. I won't lie to you, the gallery has seen better days, but with the right funding, you can restore its former prestige." Jalen looked around. The walls, once adorned with artwork that screamed exclusivity, now seemed barren. The space felt empty, not just physically, but spiritually. There was no life here anymore. He turned back to Langley. "I remember coming here once," Jalen said, his tone casual. "I had a portfolio full of my work. Thought maybe I had a shot at being featured in this gallery." Langley barely reacted, waving a hand dismissively. "A lot of young artists have tried. Only a select few make it into Langley Fine Arts." Jalen nodded, his smile never fading. "Yeah. I remember. You looked at my work for less than a minute before calling it street art and telling me to find a different career." For the first time, Langley froze. He blinked, looking at Jalen's face, studying it more closely. And then, realization hit him like a freight train. Jalen watched as Langley's expression shifted from neutral, to confusion, to shock. "You." Langley's voice cracked slightly. "You're Jalen Okoye," Jalen said smoothly. "The same artist you rejected. The same artist whose painting just sold for $5 million. Langley's jaw dropped slightly. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk. He looked down at the contract, at Jalen, at the name printed in bold letters. The buyer of his gallery was not some anonymous investor. It was the very man he had dismissed years ago. You're the buyer?" Langley's voice was barely above a whisper. Jalen leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes with unwavering confidence. "Yes," Jalen said. "And I'm buying it outright. No negotiations. No counteroffers." He let the words sink in. "This gallery will no longer carry your name. It's time for a new era." But the real moment that changed everything came when the world's most exclusive auction house, Sterling and Green, announced they would be auctioning off a rare Jalen Okoye original titled Rebirth. The estimate? Between $2 million and $3 million. Jalen had seen his paintings sell for hundreds of thousands, but this was a different level. This was history. The auction that shocked the art world. The evening of the auction arrived. The grand ballroom of Sterling and Green was filled with the elite of the elite, oil magnates, Hollywood producers, foreign royalty, and billionaires who collected art the way others collected watches. Jalen sat quietly in the back, watching, unnoticed. The bidding started at $1 million. Within seconds, it jumped to $2 million. Then $3 million. The room buzzed with excitement. The auctioneer's voice rang out, $3 million. Do I hear 4? $4 million. yes, to the gentleman in the back. 5 million? We have 5 million. Gasps filled the room. The final hammer fell at $5.2 million. The crowd erupted into applause. Jalen sat in stunned silence. He had just become a multimillionaire off a single painting. His name wasn't just in the art world anymore. It was in history books. Victor Langley tries to buy Jalen's work. 2 days later, Jalen's phone buzzed with a message from Xavier Lorenzo. This is hilarious. Victor Langley is trying to buy one of your pieces for his gallery. Jalen nearly dropped his phone. Langley? The same gallery owner who mocked him? Lorenzo sent a screenshot of the inquiry. Langley had emailed one of the private collectors who owned an early Jalen Okoye painting, offering $400,000 for it. The irony hit like a freight train. Langley, the same man who dismissed him as a nobody, was now desperate to showcase his art. And he had no idea that the artist he had insulted years ago was now the one dictating the terms of the art world. Jalen chuckled. Oh, how the tables had turned. But he wasn't done yet. No. The real twist was yet to come. Jalen Okoye leaned back in his leather chair, the city lights of New York twinkling outside his penthouse window. A glass of wine sat untouched beside him. The auction had made headlines worldwide. His painting selling for $5.2 million had turned him from an underground sensation into one of the most sought-after artists of the decade. And now? Now, he was about to do something he had dreamed of for years. He was going back to Langley Fine Arts. But not as an artist seeking approval. As the buyer. A gallery on the brink of collapse. The art world had changed, and Victor Langley had failed to change with it. While Jalen's name soared through social media, celebrity homes, and billion-dollar collections, Langley's gallery had been slowly dying. His refusal to embrace new voices had left his business outdated. The younger generation wasn't interested in the same old European-style oil paintings that lined his walls. For every door slammed in our face, we build our own. At first, it was just a few likes. Then a few hundred. Then thousands. Something about his work resonated. It wasn't just art, it was a movement. The breakthrough. Late one night, Jalen's phone buzzed with a notification. A comment under his latest painting, from an account with a small blue checkmark. At Xavier Lorenzo, your work is breathtaking. DM me. Jalen's eyes widened. He knew that name. Xavier Lorenzo was one of the most respected private collectors in the world, known for discovering hidden talent before anyone else. If Lorenzo was interested, that meant one thing: Jalen was no longer invisible. Nervously, he replied. Within an hour, they were on a video call. Lorenzo's voice was smooth and deliberate. You have something rare, Jalen, he said. Your work doesn't just sit on a wall, it demands to be felt. Jalen's breath caught in his throat. No one had ever described his art like that. I want to introduce you to some people, Lorenzo continued. People who understand what you bring to the table. Real collectors. High-end buyers. If you're ready to take this seriously, I can help you get there. Jalen didn't even hesitate. I'm ready. From Instagram to exclusive auctions, Lorenzo wasn't bluffing. Within weeks, Jalen's paintings were being privately auctioned to collectors, and the numbers were staggering. The first piece sold for $15,000. The next, $50,000. Soon, his paintings were commanding six-figure prices. Art magazines started calling him the breakout talent of the decade. Celebrities began buying his pieces and sharing them on social media. Jay-Z, Rihanna. Even Oprah. One evening, as Jalen sat in his apartment, staring at his phone in disbelief, he received a message from Lorenzo. Congrats. Your latest piece just sold at auction for $250,000. Jalen closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had gone from being mocked in a gallery to selling paintings for $250,000. But he wasn't done yet. The world was watching now. And soon, even Victor Langley would have no choice but to see his name everywhere. Jalen Okoye stood on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, gazing at the New York City skyline. The same city that once rejected him, that mocked his work, was now filled with collectors willing to pay fortunes just to own one of his paintings. He had come a long way from that humiliating day at Langley Fine Arts. His rise had been nothing short of meteoric. It started with whispers in the art world, an unknown black artist creating pieces that defied classification. His paintings were a blend of raw emotion and bold storytelling, touching something deep within the human soul. Then, the collectors came. Rappers, actors, Wall Street tycoons, everyone wanted a Jalen Okoye original. Now, his art was featured in Art Review, Modern Collector, and even Forbes. Listen, I see artists like you all the time. You think passion alone sells? It doesn't. Prestige sells. Connections sell. This? He tapped one of Jalen's paintings with a manicured finger. This is the kind of thing you'd see spray-painted on the side of a building, not hanging in an exclusive gallery. Jalen felt a wave of heat rise in his chest. He clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. With all due respect, Mr. Langley, art is supposed to evoke emotion, to challenge, to tell stories. My work, Langley held up a hand, cutting him off. Let me give you some free advice, find a different career. Art like this? It doesn't sell. At least, not to anyone with real money. Jalen's jaw tightened. He could feel the stares of nearby patrons, their whispered judgments pressing into him like sharp needles. The humiliation was suffocating. He had come here with hope, only to be dismissed like he was nothing. For a moment, he considered walking away in silence, accepting defeat. But then, something inside him shifted. A realization. A resolve. He carefully gathered his artwork, sliding each piece back into his portfolio with precision. When he finally met Langley's smug gaze again, he didn't let the disappointment show. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile. Thank you for your time, Mr. Langley, he said, his voice steady. I'll remember this conversation. Langley gave a dismissive nod and turned away, already engaging another guest in conversation, as if Jalen had never existed. As Jalen walked out of the gallery and onto the bustling streets of New York, his mind was no longer clouded with doubt. He didn't need Langley's validation. He didn't need permission to succeed. One day, he promised himself, the world would beg to display his work. And when that day came, Victor Langley would regret every single word. Jalen Okoye walked the streets of New York with his portfolio clutched under his arm, but this time, he wasn't looking for galleries to accept him. He was looking for his audience directly. That night, he sat on the worn-out couch in his small Brooklyn apartment, staring at his paintings propped against the walls. The colors, the depth, the emotion, he knew his work had something special. If the gatekeepers wouldn't let him in, he would break down the gates himself. He picked up his phone and hesitated only for a moment before creating an Instagram account at Okoye Artistry. He started posting his paintings one by one, accompanied by raw, heartfelt captions. He didn't just showcase his art, he told the stories behind them. A woman sitting in deep thought, painted in swirls of blue and gold. She dreams of more, but is told she deserves less. She will prove them wrong. A child reaching toward a bright red balloon, the colors clashing against a stormy gray background. We are all still that child, grasping for something bigger than ourselves. A clenched fist, painted in bold strokes of crimson and black. The bell chimed softly as Jalen Okoye stepped into Langley Fine Arts, the gallery known for showcasing the works of elite painters and sculptors. The place had an air of sophistication, with its high ceilings, sleek white walls, and strategically placed spotlights illuminating the paintings. Wealthy patrons strolled through, murmuring in appreciation at pieces adorned with outrageous price tags. Jalen clutched the large portfolio in his hands, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had worked tirelessly for this moment, sleepless nights, endless revisions, pushing every brushstroke until his emotions bled onto the canvas. This was his shot. If Victor Langley, the owner and self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the fine arts world, gave him a chance, it could change everything. He approached the front desk, where a young receptionist barely spared him a glance. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked in a bored tone, not bothering to look up from her computer. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Langley," Jalen said, straightening his posture. "I'm an artist, and I'd love for him to review my work." The receptionist exhaled loudly, as if exhausted by the very idea, before reluctantly gesturing toward a tall, sharply dressed man across the gallery. Victor Langley, in his perfectly tailored navy suit, was talking animatedly with an older gentleman about an abstract piece that had just sold for 6 figures. Jalen inhaled deeply and made his way over. He waited patiently as the conversation wrapped up, his fingers tightening around the leather handle of his portfolio. Langley finally turned, his gray eyes sweeping over Jalen with barely concealed disinterest. "Yes?" His voice carried a clipped, impatient edge. "Mr. Langley, my name is Jalen Okoye. I'm an artist, and I was hoping to show you my work. I believe my pieces would be a great fit for your gallery." He tried to keep his voice steady, confident. Langley let out a small chuckle, his lips curling in amusement. "Oh? And what kind of art do you do?" Jalen's pulse quickened. He unzipped his portfolio and carefully pulled out a few of his best pieces, vibrant, soul-stirring paintings depicting moments of raw human emotion, movement, struggle, and triumph. His brushstrokes danced between realism and abstract expressionism, creating something unique, something alive. Langley took one glance at the work and scoffed. "Oh, I see. Urban art," he said, stretching the words out as if they were something distasteful. Jalen frowned. "I prefer to think of it as contemporary expressionism with deep cultural roots." Langley smirked. "Let me stop you right there, son." He folded his arms, looking Jalen up and down before turning his gaze back to the artwork. "This isn't the kind of thing our clientele is interested in. My buyers, real collectors, aren't looking for street art." Jalen's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to argue, but Langley continued. Jalen Okoye sat at the head of a long, polished table in a private boardroom overlooking Manhattan. The room was filled with some of the most powerful investors, business magnates, and cultural icons in the world. And they were all here for him. The discussion was no longer just about art galleries. Jalen had already revolutionized that space. Now, he was thinking bigger. "I want to build the first global art empire," Jalen said, his voice calm but commanding. A few of the older investors exchanged skeptical glances. "You already have an empire," one of them said, leaning forward. "Okoye galleries are in every major city. You've reshaped how we look at contemporary art. What more is there to do?" Jalen tapped the table. "Right now, my galleries are hubs for artists. But what about the people who have never set foot in a gallery? The ones who think art is only for the rich?" He let the question sink in. Then, he continued. "I want to make art mainstream, not just something locked away in private collections. I'm talking about a streaming platform for artists. A global online auction house where collectors from all over the world can bid in real time. An Okoye art museum in every continent." The room fell silent. Then, Xavier Lorenzo, the man who had first introduced Jalen to the art world, smiled and shook his head. "You really don't think small, do you?" Jalen smirked. "I never did." Taking art to the world, within a year, the Okoye Art Network was born. Okoye Digital Museum, a VR-based platform where anyone in the world could explore art exhibits from the comfort of their home. Okoye Auctions Online, a live-streamed auction house that allowed collectors from Africa, Asia, and South America to compete with billionaires in New York and London. The Okoye Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding young, struggling artists who lacked the resources to pursue their craft. The art world had never seen anything like it. While traditional galleries still catered to the ultra-rich, Jalen had democratized art. No longer was artistic success dependent on a handful of elite gatekeepers. Now, anyone with talent had a shot. And the numbers showed it. In the first 6 months, over 10 million people visited the Okoye Digital Museum. The online auction house generated $500 million in global art sales in its first year. The Okoye Foundation helped launch the careers of over 500 artists worldwide. Jalen had done something no one thought possible. He had made art belong to the people. The final conversation with Victor Langley one evening, as Jalen walked through his New York gallery, he found Victor Langley sitting in the corner, staring at a massive painting. It was a piece called The Rejected, a haunting, powerful self-portrait of Jalen as a young man, clutching his portfolio, standing outside the very gallery that had once turned him away. Langley turned as Jalen approached. His face was unreadable. "You changed everything," Langley said finally. Jalen crossed his arms. "That was the point." Langley hesitated. "I spent my whole career believing that art belonged in the hands of the elite. That real talent could only come from certain places, certain people." He exhaled. "I was wrong." Jalen didn't say anything. After a long pause, Langley stood up and extended his hand. "A peace offering. A final act of humility." Jalen looked at it for a moment, then shook it. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. As Langley turned to leave, Jalen called after him. "Victor." Langley paused. Jalen gestured toward the walls of his gallery, where dozens of undiscovered artists now had their work displayed for the world to see. "Now, tell me. Do you still think this is just street art?" Langley looked around one last time, at the breathtaking pieces, the emotion, the power, before nodding slowly. "No," he admitted. "This is the future." And for the first time in his life, Victor Langley walked out of the gallery with a sense of pride. Because he finally understood.